Charles Stewart III is the Keenan Son Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT. He has been teaching there since 1985. And his research and areas of expertise include congressional politics, elections, and American political development. Since 2001, he has been a member of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, and an effort that applies scientific analysis to questions about election technology, administration, and reform. He's currently a director of the project, as well, and is an established leader in the analysis of the performance of election systems and quantitative assessment of election performance. He's worked with the Pew Charitable Trusts, developing their election performance index, and he has also provided advice to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And has also established the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, and has worked, partnered with the Stanford Law School to establish the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. It's been recognized for undergraduate teaching, and is also very well known as a very popular head of house at McCormick Hall, along with his spouse, Catherine Hess. So with that, I think that is all I have to say before we can go ahead and get started. So Professor Stewart, would you like to share your screen?
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Megan, and for that nice introduction. Let me. You would think that I'm all set in sharing screens now. That I'm basically doing nothing but sharing screens anymore. But give me just a second here to get everything I need to get set up.
Okay, I can see your slides now. So
good. All right. Well, again, thanks for that introduction, and it's really great to be speaking again to the MIT Club of Boston. I've made a little bit of a tradition doing this. This is the second or third time that I have spoken right before the election. I remember talking 4 years, particularly at the faculty club, and I always enjoy those events. And it's unfortunate that we're doing this on Zoom, because I saw in the participation. Now, when you've been at MIT for 36 years, you get to you meet all sorts of folks, and just looking at the participant list, it's great to see former students and former residents of McCormick, alums of McCormick that we got to know. I even noticed that it looks like my wife's former boss is participating, and so it's maybe next 4 years from now we can do this in person, and we can greet each other personally, and that would be really great. So I'm going to be talking. The title of my talk is "Will the 2020 election be safe?" And we can think about safety in a number of ways, but I guess I will just start by giving away the punchline, and that is viewed from one perspective, and I've been giving talks on this topic now for about 6 months. We're now rolling into the election. In fact, the election in many ways has already begun. And I think an argument can be made that when it comes to voting safely and healthily, we're on a glide path to be able to have a safe and effective election. I would not have necessarily said this 6 months ago, but I think I can see the path at that direction. So now I could just stop the talk there, but there is a footnote, and that is there are no guarantees. I think somebody asked me before the talk if I was going to be talking about the debate last night, and I will be obliquely referring to it from time to time. I haven't totally incorporated last night's debate into what I'm going to say, but I will say that one of the topics that's been talked about frequently in commentary on last night's debate is that there is a possibility, I don't think it's a likelihood, but there is a real possibility that there will be there actually could be danger around the election. And actually it will, if there is danger, it is unlikely to be because of COVID per se, but it could very well be because of mis and disinformation, and could also be because of physical violence. And I'd be happy to talk about that, particularly at the end. Like I said, these are possibilities. I don't think they are likelihoods, but I'd be more than happy to talk about anything related to the election that you would like to talk about. I have a number of points I want to hit in my talk. I want to introduce you to the Healthy Elections Project for those of you who've not encountered it yet, and I'll talk a bit about that. Megan mentioned it in the introduction. And then I will talk about interest in the election. There is tremendous amount of interest in this election. There will be a lot of people coming and turning out to vote. It's possible that we will see record turnout despite all of the problems and the challenges that we're facing. So there's great interest in the election, making it even more important for us to follow the imperatives of de-densifying polling places, bolstering voting by mail, and undertaking the logistical challenges that are necessary to make it possible to vote effectively. I'm going to lay out a lot more quickly than I have been over the last few months, kind of what the imperatives are and what the challenges have been, because I think by now most people in an audience like this know what the challenges have been in revamping our elections process very quickly. But I do want to at least frame what the issues are to help us perhaps discuss these at the end in the questions and answers. I'm going to say some things about how we're doing, although as I've already suggested, I actually think that America's election administration officials have actually done a pretty good job, sometimes after getting kicked in the teeth from how they handle things during the primaries. But I think that we're actually on a glide path to do much better than many people had worried or suspected back in the spring when the pandemic hit. But despite the fact that I am optimistic about what voting will look like in November and our ability to pull off this election with integrity, I do have some worries at this point, and I will tell you what I'm worrying about these days. So let me tell you about the Healthy Elections Project to start, because this is really what had been framing my thinking about the election in 2020 and has really taken over my life over the last several months. I was writing somebody the other day, and it's really quite literally true that I'm working about 16 hours a day on this project, have been for several months. You can ask my spouse, Kathy, and she will certainly vouch for that, and anticipating doing this through Election Day. The Healthy Elections Project is joint with the Stanford Law School. I'm working with Nate personally. Nate is an attorney, a legal scholar, and a political scientist. Nate is professor of political science and law at Stanford. We got to know each other when we worked together on the President's Commission on Election Administration, which President Obama appointed back in 2013. Nate was the research director. He asked me as the co-director of the Voting Technology Project to put together a team of social scientists, engineers, operations researchers, designers to give expert testimony, write white papers, and to help the commission do its job, which we did. And I think it was great success. The important thing for this is that Nate and I have gotten to be known as two academics who actually will talk with election administrators, will hear them out, and help them with their problems. And this is in many ways an MIT sort of thing, where we roll up our sleeves and we, help people to solve problems. This is mens et manus at its best. When COVID started rolling in, a number of actors in the foundation world saw that litigation was beginning to form around voting in the election. And I think many of you all know the nature of the litigation that is that's happening right now in this space. And while much of that litigation to protect access to the polls can be considered important, nonetheless, Nate and I are both convinced, as well as our foundation sponsors, that you can't litigate yourself to an effective election. And in fact, the main obstacles facing election administrators as they were looking at how to vote amidst the pandemic, those obstacles were logistical, they were practical, and that we needed to help them. And the foundation world thought they needed some help. And so Nate and I banded together with assistance from Hewlett to form a university endeavor to accumulate the best research we could find, to find the best tools out there to offer to election officials and to work with election officials to help implement practical change to make the pivots in the ways that they needed to go. After we got going with foundation support, a number of other donors came forward to help to support our efforts and the efforts of our partners. And so this has been a multi-million-dollar effort. Some of that money has come to Stanford and to MIT, and I'll tell you in just a bit about what we've been doing at Stanford and at MIT, but it's also helped to support many of our partners in other universities and the civic tech space, retired election officials who are actually going and embedding in various election jurisdictions that are at risk, that are undergoing rapid change right now, doing a number of things. We've been involved in recruiting poll workers and even actually finding PPE for some places. So we've been really very, very active in ways that academics usually aren't. So we're doing that. Well, we have a website, and I'd like you just to draw this to your attention because it will reflects a lot about what we've been doing. You can take a look. You can take a look now, although I would hope that you wouldn't you would pay more attention to me than to the website. But there's a lot of stuff on the website, healthyelections.org. If you go to the website, which is dynamic, it changes every day. We have new things. One of the things you will see is a bunch of reports. We have a team of students at Stanford. There's about 50 in the law school and the university, the design school, the ed school, who are working with Nate. I have about a dozen students, postdocs, UROPs, who are working with me, doing more quantitative work in studying a wide variety of topics. We've been doing close deep dives into the state responses to voting in COVID. We've been writing about various topics such as signature matching and logistics and the postal service and those sorts of things. So you can go to the website and you can see all sorts of reports about what states have been doing. You can see all sorts of reports about voting by mail and resources related to voting by mail. Designing in-person polling places. The Stanford Design School has developed some really interesting resources giving advice to election officials about how to design polling places that will maintain public health. We have tools about, we have information about becoming a poll worker, and this will come back several times. That's a really important thing. We have a number of tools, some of them developed at MIT, the Sloan School, the Political Science Department, but also at other universities around the country to help election officials manage in-person polling places, Dropbox locations, voting locations, you name it, mail logistics, all sorts of things. There's that. There's data. There's a data visualization map with some statistics relevant to voting by mail. We have a wide variety of other reports. For instance, we just wrote in the last few days this report on voter intentions in November, a survey from 7 voters in 7 battleground states that I released last week. There's a litigation tracker for those of you who want to follow the litigation. And so there is a ton of stuff. This is the premier, I mean, and this is actually a fact. It's not just salesmanship. This is the premier university-based response to voting during COVID. One-stop shopping of information for the general public and for election administrators. And I'd encourage y'all to go and check it out. So now, let me just talk about the election and what we're seeing right now. The first thing I want to say is that there is evidence that this is a historic election in terms of interest. We saw evidence of interest in voting actually show up in 2018, when we saw turnout in the 2018 election shoot up to historic levels. What I'm showing you here is a graph of the percentage of eligible Americans who have voted in every election since 1788. And the orange lines are voting in the midterm congressional elections. The blue line is the percentage voting in the presidential election. I could give an entire lecture just on this graph alone, but I just point out a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the orange line, you will notice a huge shoot up in 2018, where for the first time in over a century, more than half of eligible voters voted in a congressional election. You had to go back to 1914 to get turnout at that level before the passage of the Women's Suffrage Amendment. If the increase in turnout in 2020 is only at half the rate of that change, you would have to go back to 1900 for a presidential year to see interest or see turnout that high. And everything that we're reading and hearing from local and state election officials suggesting that interest is really, really high in this election. Interest is really high in public opinion surveys. When you ask voters if it really matters, as this survey did from Pew, who wins the presidency, it's at historic rates, at least over the last 20 years. And it's hard to imagine any other election in the last century in which, with perhaps maybe the election of 1932, for instance, a few other notable historic elections where there's been such interest. Another metric of interest in this election actually was turnout during the primaries themselves. Despite the fact that there was, actually the Democratic nomination got locked up pretty quickly, turnout in the primaries was, on average, slightly above where turnout was in the 2016 Democratic primary. And it was, of course, lower on the Republican side, but there really was no effort. And oftentimes, actually, there weren't even real primaries on the Republican side. But on the Democratic side, turnout was at the levels comparable to 2016. The major exception to that was in the primaries for Wisconsin and Ohio in April, which were the two primaries that really continued during the height of the pandemic. When things picked up again in May and June, turnout was again at, or rather slightly above on average where it had been in 2016. People wanted to vote. They were voting in the Democratic primary even after Joe Biden had locked up the nomination. So again, there's great interest in this. And we also can see the interest in this election over the last couple of weeks as states have begun to mail out mail ballots, as a few states have begun to run in-person early voting. Over 1 million ballots have already been cast. Now, in the end, it'll be about 150 million. So this is a little drop in the bucket, but the important thing to note is that people are already voting, and I'll show you something else later on to suggest there's great eagerness to get out there and vote. Okay, so back when the pandemic hit in March, I used to talk a lot about the imperatives that were facing the country at the time. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a sample of that, because I think all of y'all now have lived through this. But I want to underscore a couple of points along the way. We had one big imperative in the election administration world that was clear from the beginning. And this was to de-densify in-person polling places in the same way that we were de-densifying everything else we were doing inside. Okay. This had two major features to it. First of all, we had to move people away from in-person voting. And the only way to do that is to have more voting by mail. And then we also had to decrease basically the capacity of in-person polling places while maintaining as many
polling places as possible. That is to say, we had to move voting booths apart, voting machines apart, far apart from each other. And it turns out, if you apply the various queuing models, et cetera, despite the fact that maybe only half as many people will be voting in person in 2020 as in 2016, because of how we've had to reconfigure polling places, we still need as many polling places now as we did in 2016. And in fact, in some ways, we might need more, just to keep people apart from each other. And this is a point. This is a point that both Nate and I have been hammering on ever since April. Getting people to vote by mail is important, but maintaining polling places is also as critical. There are some people who need to vote in person. Secondly, as many of y'all understand, voting by mail sometimes is not all that smooth. People who want to vote by mail, but something has come up, voting in person is a fail-safe for people who still want to vote when the mail route has failed for some reason. There are people who distrust the mail and would not trust that their ballot would be counted if it were left to be delivered by the post office. There will be, believe it or not, some late deciders who will decide at the end of October that it's a pretty, why don't I vote this time? And it will be too late for them to vote by mail. And as I said earlier on, we need to maintain polling places because of the nature of the physical distancing those polling places have to engage in. This is all what the CDC says. So we know what the imperative was. There were challenges in the midst of that imperative. The most basic challenge was the lack of experience voting by mail. This is a graph showing the percentage of people who, voters who have voted in the three major modes of voting since the 1996 election: in person on election day, by mail, and in person and early voting. From 1996 to the present, the percentage of people voting on election day has dropped from 90% down to 60% in 2016. Replacing election day voting has been a gradual, constant rise of mail balloting up to 20%, a bit over 20% in 2016, and a kind of a stair-step increase in early in-person voting. So that in 2016, we had 60% roughly voting on election day, 20% voting by mail, 20% voting early. And what you can see how the system has evolved over time. And this is the type of discontinuous change that we're talking about making in 2020. This is a dramatic change by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a change not at the national level so much as it is a change at the state level. We have to remember, elections are administered at the state level. Actually, I'll go back to this previous slide. Half of this increase in the percentage of people voting by mail from 96 to 21 has occurred in 3 states. So this is a very asymmetrical and uneven change. So here's my favorite graph. MIT students will recognize, our alums will recognize a ternary triplot. I should note that I use this plot a lot when I talk to election officials, and it is one of the most famous plots in all of election administration. They love it. I was shocked. But the way that you read this plot is, this is a plot in 1996 of the percentage of people who were voting on election day in states by mail or by voting early. A state, if it's the very top of that triangle, everybody in the state is voting on election day. If everybody is down in the lower corner of the triangle, everybody is voting by mail. And if everybody is on the right, everybody is voting early in person. In 1996, the great majority of states were way at the top. There were a few states, such as Washington and Oregon, that were already beginning to develop these vote by mail systems. Another couple of states, Tennessee and Texas, were beginning to experiment with vote centers and having early voting. This is what this plot looked like in 2016, where a good number of states had gone down the left leg of the triangle. Several have gone down the right leg of the triangle. There's much greater diversity. But the point here is that there's just a few states that have gone way down that left triangle. And that in order to affect this move to voting by mail, it's the states that have not been voting by mail before that have to move down to the left in order to make this work. And that's going to be a big challenge, administrative challenge. I mean, a lot of y'all are, in the private sector, in management. You understand how hard it is to effect disruptive change on a fast timetable. So it's not only disruptive; there are capacity issues. If you have a system in which maybe only 2% of your ballots, let's say you have 100. Let's say you're the city of Boston. You have 300,000 voters, and you have 2% of your ballots are by mail in a presidential election. You can handle that with a few temps and by cordoning off part of a conference room or an assembly room to handle mail ballots. It's not a big deal. If half of your voters, if you go from a couple of thousand to 100,000 or 200,000, you can't do that in a conference room. You need to buy equipment like this sorter. This piece of equipment basically costs what it costs to buy a fire truck. And we know that fire trucks cost between $100,000 and $500,000. Okay, really expensive equipment and not easy to operate. And so there's now this rush for building up this capacity to find the money to buy this equipment, to get it installed, to get it in train. There's also restrictive laws, and I can go on for a long time about this, but a lot of states have designed their vote by mail systems really to discourage voting by mail and make it easy to reject mail ballots. The best example was New York, and we saw this in the primary, where there were some counties that were rejecting over 10% of the mail ballots in the primaries. In the 2016 election, there were counties in New York that were rejecting over 20%, 25, 30% of mail ballots. Okay, and that's largely because there was a very arcane user-unfriendly rules in New York, other states, making it hard to vote by mail, easy to reject ballots. Developing this capacity is hard organizationally. When I first started giving these talks, I have the slide, I'm not going to go through it, but Nate and I went through and we basically looked at all the vote by mail processes that needed to be put into place and nail down if you were going to do a large vote by mail program. And it goes, it touches on both procurement and staffing and goes all the way from basically getting the voter rolls set to all the processes of mailing out, returning, and counting the ballots. It's an entirely different way of running an election than running an in-person election. Okay, so that was on the mail balloting side. There's also protecting polling places. Remember, we were having problems of keeping polling places open in the spring, and it was because we were having problems with people and with places, and that is poll workers were pulling out, and places were making themselves unavailable to be places, meaning churches, firehouses, and such places were saying, no, we don't want strangers, we don't want outsiders coming into our building to run an election. The poster child for this problem was Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee. The gold here is, I've laid Milwaukee on its side, so it'll fit on the slide, but the blue dots were the polling places planned for in Milwaukee in the Wisconsin primary in April. These are the ones they planned. These are the ones they opened. 95% of the polling places in Milwaukee did not open, largely because poll workers refused to work because they were worried about their health. And this happened all over the country, less dramatically, but it still happened. And then there were the problems of getting things, Purell, PPE, etc. Election officials have been competing with the healthcare sector to get this equipment, and it's only been recently that they've been able to get what they need for this election. Okay, so that was a challenge. How are we doing? Well, there are two different ways to think about what we're doing. There's some people who remember this picture also from Milwaukee, which is one commentary on how things happened. That was early in the pandemic. By the end of the pandemic, we were seeing situations more like this. This was arena voting in Louisville, Kentucky, where they took the 6th largest arena in America and made it, put it open for anybody to come and vote in that county, and also had a very robust vote by mail system. By all accounts, things went really well, and that primary, which was highly competitive, a couple of races, went very, very smoothly. I'll just also remind you what I said earlier about turnout. People turned out and voted, with a little hiccup during the height of the pandemic. Not only did they turn out to vote, but they figured out how to vote by mail. This is a graph that illustrates the relationship between the fraction of ballots that were cast by mail in all the states that had primaries in 2016 versus 2020. 2016 is blue, red is 2020. The states I'm showing you are the states before the pandemic hit. This is what happens when we add the states after the pandemic hit. People went and they figured out how to vote by mail. There was some hiccups, but nonetheless, vote by mail happened, and it happened fast. People now are planning to vote by mail. This is a similar graph, which now compares the percentage of vote by mail usage in 2016 to a survey taken a few months ago, where people around the country were asked, how do you plan to vote in November? And massive numbers are saying that they're going to vote by mail. So election officials have been working, they've been paddling sort of like, they've been sort of like the ducks, actually not even ducks in the water, because ducks, they're pretty smooth on the top and they're really frantic underneath. Election officials, the ones I talked to, have been frantic now for 6 months. They've been working very, very hard to do all the things that I alluded to earlier in the talk. Some are doing it better than others, but I think on the whole, the election administration community has stepped up, even when state legislatures haven't stepped up, even when Congress hasn't stepped up, and even when the campaigns through their litigation, and it's actually both parties, have gotten in the way of their planning for the election. But I do have some worries. First worry I have is just about partisanship endangering people. And by this, I want to just directly state that I think that the attacks on voting by mail will be driving people to vote in person who should more appropriately vote from home. This has become a partisan issue, with Republicans listening to President Trump attack mail balloting. And by the way, I mean, I think actually mail balloting can be criticized on policy grounds. But one consequence of the strong attack from President Trump is that Republicans are reporting, at least, that they are not going to vote by mail, and they are going to go and vote in person. Well, good. Actually, I'm planning on voting in person, but it's because I know that what they've done in Cambridge and that they're ready for it. I'm worried that the rush to get people to vote in person because of partisan reasons in some parts of this country are going to pack voters together in polling places in very unsafe ways. And the partisan differences over voting started in April, have persisted in some of the surveys that I've been doing. I'm doing some tracking surveys now in the battleground states, and there's huge partisan differences. And I think one consequence of that is going to be put people at danger. I have some worries about mail voting. Worry about voters waiting too late and voters not following instructions. I have a paper that's gotten a lot of, I've talked to a lot of reporters about this, so at least somebody is reading it. In 2016, about between 1.5% and 2% of people who tried to vote by mail were unsuccessful in getting their ballot counted because of postal problems, but mostly because of mistakes they made returning their absentee ballot. There are risks to returning ballots. The great majority of, the largest reasons why absentee ballots get rejected is that they arrive too late and that voters don't follow the instructions on the certificates. And I worry about this. I worry about 2% of ballots being rejected. I worry about those people being disenfranchised. I also worry about a close election where there may be a recount and those ballots are being fought over, okay? But I have been worried about people waiting too late to vote. I'm becoming heartened though in what I'm beginning to see. And let me just show you, this is something actually I was looking at right before the talk and I just threw it onto the slides. And it might be too confusing, but I want to show you why I'm actually feeling a little bit sanguine about things right now. I've been looking a lot at North Carolina, and I'm looking at all the battleground states and at their usage of mail ballots. This is a plot which shows it shows from 2016 and the weeks preceding the election in 2016, the number of ballots that were requested every week. That's the blue line in North Carolina, and the red line is the cumulative number of ballots that were requested in roughly the 3 months before the election. You will notice that blue line grows and grows and grows and grows until about 3 weeks before the election. Okay, crescendos as you get toward the election. The worry among people in the election community has been that this would be the pattern in 2020, such that election officials would be inundated by ballot requests right as the election was upon them, and that those ballots would not be mailed back in time. Been studying the actual patterns in North Carolina, and it looks like this is going to be the same pattern in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the other states we're looking at as well. Front loading of requests in North Carolina. In 2016, so we've done some estimates about how many mail ballots will eventually be requested in North Carolina, and I will stand by those estimates. Sitting here today, we're about 60% to where I estimate North Carolina is going to be in terms of mail ballots for this election. 4 years ago, we were only 30% of the way to getting to where North Carolina ended up being. So, front loading, that's good news. Okay, so I am worried about still people, their ballots coming in late, but voters have responded. They have listened to voter education efforts and are requesting their ballots early, and they are returning them early, and that's a good thing. I'm worried about in-person voting and particularly poll workers. The lack of poll workers is the biggest problem right now with in-person voting. For those of you in Massachusetts, if you go to the Secretary of State's website, you can click on a link and you can see the towns and municipalities that still need poll workers. If you think it's safe for you, I would encourage you to look at this. It's getting late. Do it now. Don't hesitate. Poll workers are still needed. Although again, the number of towns that are still in need of poll workers is declining with every passing day. Nonetheless, poll workers are still needed. Okay. One final worry, and that is something called the red mirage. The red mirage is this. Although I prefer to call it the blue shift, because that's the term that I've been associated with in my scholarship. But here's the idea. If basically Republicans are going to be voting in person and Democrats are going to be voting by mail, which is the cartoon version of this, but it makes it easy to explain what's going on. If Republicans are voting in person, Democrats by mail, and if the in-person votes are counted first, and the mail ballots lag behind, then we could find ourselves in a situation where it looks like President Trump has won a landslide on election day, but as the mail ballots get counted, that landslide is going to disappear, and it'll either be a much closer victory for President Trump, or it'll be a close victory for Joe Biden. But the important thing is the trajectory of the vote count and the days following the election. And I'm going to jump over this because I want to finish the talk and go to questions. But I think you can kind of intuit the math here. And there's been a number of articles written about this. President Trump already has demonstrated his willingness to be disruptive in the Twitter sphere when there have been dynamics like this in other elections, and particularly in the 2018 election in Florida. There was a red mirage, big blue shift in the counting there. And he was very active in basically tweeting that they should shut down the counting of absentee ballots and just take the election day count. And we can see this happening. Now, a lot is being written about this. I am not so as worried about this, and I would encourage you, for those of you who subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, Nate and I had an op-ed this last week in the Saturday edition, where we have leaned against this notion that we're not going to know on election night who's likely to be the winner, that there will be such a huge red mirage and such a big blue shift that things will be chaotic. The simple version is that there's actually a lot more parallel play in the counting of ballots. And those absentee ballots that you're worried about being counted in the days following the general election actually might be counted before election day, and certainly on election day. So things may not be so bad as some people imagine. But nonetheless, I am worried about the dynamics after election day. So let me just end with another op-ed that Nate and I have also recently written. It appeared in the New York Times last week, a week ago, when it was 6 weeks to the election, 6 ways to protect it. And I will actually emphasize in this talk for the people listening, number one, if you don't have a plan on how you're going to vote, make it and make it now. And think about how to have a resilient plan in the event, for instance, there's a kick up in the pandemic in the next few weeks. That's, I would say, for this group is a really important thing. There's some other commentary here that I think is important. But you know, the election is upon us, and people need to be intentional about how they intend to vote. The logistics have been taken care of or not. The cooperation has happened or not. The appropriations have happened or not. And now is the time to vote. And I encourage all of you to vote, but to have a plan. Oh, and to volunteer to work the polls. So at that, I will stop, and I'm sure that there are questions, and I'm happy to take them, and I will take questions, comments until the Boston Club tells me to stop.
Okay, thank you very much. that was a very, very interesting, and I just have to say that you know, makes me feel like a tremendous hero, because I did sign up to be a poll worker this year. I worked at I did work the primary election here in Somerville, and it was actually a lot more fun. I feel like, wow, I learned so much more about the nuts and bolts of, you know, how voting is actually run.
Right.
So it really is a great experience, and I absolutely did not get sick. So that was they had lots of PPE and distancing. But yeah, so my concern was just the one concern that I had coming out of that was, if we do have a record turnout of people voting in person come November, and we're still socially distancing, which I believe we will be doing, it's there's going to be some long lines, at least in my precinct. So,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Obama said, you might have to bring a chair and bring a bag lunch, but
There you go. And so, by the way, I mean, as an aside on that, I mean, I alluded to this, but one of the things we have on our website is a toolkit that a student of Steve Graves at Sloan put together to help election officials actually reconfigure and plan for social distancing so that you could manage the lines better. And so we're trying to help out where we can.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that the veterans who had worked the polls many years before said that they didn't see the usual sort of rush hour of like before work and after work. It was more spread out during the day, and I think that's just because so many people working from home.
Yeah, and that is a good thing. I mean, that's an important point. I mean, the lines basically occur right at the opening of the polls. So if you're worried about lines, then wait until 9, 10, middle of the day. It'll be 11.
Yeah, I was gonna say we usually they said that they typically see it just when they open, after work, and just before closing. There's always always a small crowd of people rushing in at the end. So and plan accordingly.
Right.
From Richard Jendryzik, do you have any comments on the possibility of violence being used to intimidate minorities?
Comments about violence. I do. I mean, the first thing I would say, by the way, is that we forget in 2016 there was actually concern about this as well, and election officials had already kind of developed relationships with local law enforcement around this. One of the things I've learned in talking to people in Homeland Security is actually there is great concern, much greater concern in 2020 than in 2016, based on credible evidence that there are kind of militia type groups that are planning on mobilizing and at least intimidating around polling places. And so I am worried about that. I mean, I know that, like I said, officials are planning for that, but it is something to be concerned about. The other thing that I'm concerned about has to do, and that is being planned for, and I'm in some of these conversations, is to anticipate possibilities of disruptions if there are extended counts, recounts, et cetera, in some states, particularly Pennsylvania, Michigan, and others where it's likely to be a longer count. For those of you who were around for the 2000 election, you will remember, for instance, the event, one of my favorite events in the recount in Florida, known as the Brooks Brothers Riot. And the Brooks Brothers Riot was actually a bunch of law attorneys storming the election office in Miami-Dade, and they actually disrupted the counting of absentee ballots there to the point that they actually had to stop counting the ballots. They could not continue counting the ballots. And so it's actually also disruptions like that I'm actually more worried about than disruptions at the polls on election day. It's more that if it takes a long time to count the ballots, a certain segment of the population can get antsy and may want to take things into their own hands. So buckle in. That's going to be something to watch.
Okay. Another question from Amy Moot. Which disputed states do not count ballots before election day? In other words, which state should we encourage Democrats to vote in person?
Actually, it turns out it doesn't matter as much about whether they're counted on election day as opposed to just kind of the things that need to be done. I mean, Megan, for instance, knows that in Massachusetts, they're all counted on election day because during her downtimes, she was probably, feeding those absentee ballots into the scanner. And my wife was a clerk at a Cambridge precinct. There are other things. I mean, yes, there is counting on election day, but because of the procedures that Massachusetts does, but also other states, New Hampshire, et cetera, they count on election day. they can get through things quickly. So I'm not so worried. The places that I'm worried about are actually Pennsylvania is the state I'm most worried about. And there it's not because of problem. I mean, part of it is they're not going to start processing until election day. But they have probably the most partisan election administration system in the country. I remember this from college and graduate school when I had, they actually elect their precinct workers. The precinct what we call the warden and the clerk in Pennsylvania are actually constitutionally elected officers. And it's very hard for county officials to sanction them if they don't behave properly, if they don't show up, if they don't go to training. And there's also a tradition in Pennsylvania of partisan frivolous challenges to absentee ballots. And so it's really more Pennsylvania that I'm worried about. But again, that's because of the overall election administration system in Pennsylvania, rather than the fact that they're counting all on election day. Wisconsin all counts on election day. They're going to be done by midnight. Florida actually no, Florida counts before, but Wisconsin, they'll be fine. Pennsylvania, watch out for it.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I think in Massachusetts this time they did get permission to do to count some of the early voting. The early ballots were counted early, so we were still doing some downtime feeding the ballots in, also because of the drop boxes.
Right.
People could bring their vote to the ballot to the drop box until the polls closed. So we were still sitting around there waiting for them to bring us a last batch before we could go home. Yeah. All right, another question. Scott Johnson would like to know, what systems are in place to prevent double voting across states?
Double voting across states. Now that's, well, I mean, a couple of things. One, the fact that it's a felony in all states to do that. And so let me tell you what is in place. Since there is no national centralized voter registration system, if someone was intent on voting more than once in an election, and they were registered in two places, and they really wanted to cast two ballots, they could get away with it if they were intent on doing it. In every election, we know that several people do it. It's the most common, people who've studied this, it is actually the most common, not in presidential elections, but in local elections. And in particular, people from Massachusetts who have their winter home down in Florida feel like that because they pay taxes down in Florida, they should be able to vote in local elections down there and local elections up here in Massachusetts. That is the most common form of double voting across states. There are ways of catching that. And there are increasingly programs of states sharing their voter rolls, and after the elections, at least finding these cases. New Hampshire is actually very vigorous in basically doing matches with the surrounding states. There is a program called ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information System, which is an information sharing compact among 30 states or so, and they regularly are sharing their voter files and also their driver's license files and other files across the states. And one of the things that is possible in doing that is not only cleaning the rolls, but eventually finding people who have double voted across states. As far as we know, double voting across states does happens in small numbers. And until we get a single unified voter registration system, which I don't think we ever will get, it's going to be impossible to totally guarantee that somebody can't do it if they really intend to do it. They really want to commit a felony. There you go.
Right, well, we've had a couple of questions. What is actually involved in comparing and checking the signatures on the mailed-in ballots?
I mean, it proceeds in a couple of ways. I mean, the old-fashioned way, so think about. I actually don't. I've never watched them do it in Boston, but I imagine in Boston, for instance, what they do is you send back the ballot, and you sign your signature on the ballot, and the clerk takes your ballot, goes over to the file where they have your signature on file, and they make the comparison. Now, one of the issues here is what happens if that signature doesn't match. And in Massachusetts, I believe, but I don't want to be cited. I mean, I think this is true, but don't act on it. Fact check me on this. I believe Massachusetts now has a requirement to allow voters to cure signature mismatches if the municipal officials think that the signatures don't match. Most states allow you to cure, but some don't actually. And this is one of the risks of voting by mail. Nonetheless, there's usually a physical comparison in kind of the old-fashioned states. That $500,000 piece of equipment that I showed you, that I've seen operated in several jurisdictions. I first saw it in Chicago where they use it. One of the things that piece of equipment does is that when the envelope goes flying by this high-speed camera, it takes a picture of the envelope, which has the signature of the voter on it. That goes over to a workstation with two judges, a Democrat and a Republican. They look at that signature, and it's compared against all the signatures that the local jurisdiction has for you, which could include, by the way, not only the signature for when you registered to vote, but the signature when you got your driver's license, the signature when you paid your taxes, the signature every time you did a transaction with that jurisdiction. Now, I'm not saying this happens everywhere, but in the larger jurisdictions that have more mail voting, there's much greater automation and much more information brought to the task. The last thing, I don't want to filibuster this, but I will mention, one of the issues that arises in signature matching is that some places train really, really well, using people who are expert in training around forensic signature matching. They actually train, election workers on how to match signatures. In other places, somebody who's been doing this forever just says, take a look, and if it looks like the same person, accept it. If it doesn't, reject it. So there is variation in how good the signature matching is. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, the error is on the side of not accepting signatures, given how many do get turned down, and yet how many of those eventually get cured. And so it looks like on net, election officials in a lot of parts of the country are kind of trigger happy when it comes to signature matching.
Okay. Got a couple of other questions related to absentee and mail-in votes. I'll just put them both out there together, and you can address them. From Carolyn Kerrigan, why do some states wait to count absentee or mail-in votes until Election Day? Wouldn't it make sense to start counting as they are received? And another attendee would like, is a question about what is your view on claims that the increase in mail-in voting may lead to an increase in fraud?
Right. Carolyn, I mean, I think the question about why not process early? I mean, I think this goes back to how mail balloting was seen traditionally, and which is to say, back in when absentee balloting was first allowed, and most of the world, by the way, doesn't have absentee balloting, and the U.S. didn't have absentee balloting until about a century ago, and when it began. And it really was for people in the US who were going to be out of town or who were infirm. And for them, the alternative was not voting at all because they couldn't, given their circumstances. They were away or they couldn't get to the polls. The legal theories that grew up around absentee balloting under those circumstances, or the legal theory, was that the voter assumes all of the risks of voting under those circumstances. Because after all, it's, if you want to vote, here it is. Take it or leave it. And very few people took it. There wasn't a whole, there weren't a whole lot of ballots. Massachusetts, historically, most states for most of the 20th century into the 21st, only about 2 to 5% of their ballots were by mail. And a lot of states, like Massachusetts, but Massachusetts is not alone, they have procedures that really only get done in the polling places. Megan, was doing some of them when she was working the polls in Somerville, checking people off the list and doing those sorts of things. Those lists get distributed to the polling places. And so just the way things have been set up, all the administrative capacity was in the polling place. And election departments did not have large offices because, they just needed a warehouse and a small office because they weren't processing mail ballots. It was being processed in the polling places. As the number of mail ballots has grown, states have changed their laws and legal theories such that now the state assumes the responsibilities. And they've started buying that equipment. They've started tricking out, the process. And so it's just a different mindset about kind of just how you handle the ballots. Are we going to see more fraud? I'm tempted to say a small number multiplied by 0 is as big as a big number multiplied by 0. But that would be too flippant. Look, absentee balloting does provide opportunities for people to behave poorly. All the evidence we have, and we have a lot of evidence about this, all the evidence we have is that mail ballot fraud is about as common as people being hit by lightning. And so maybe instead of one person being hit by lightning, 2 people will be hit by lightning in 2020. The bigger risk of voting by mail is not large-scale fraud, but that we know between kind of in the range of 2 to 3% of people who try to vote by mail will be stymied because a signature doesn't match, they didn't follow the instructions, they didn't get their ballot in on time. Those sorts of things. We have quantified those things, and they are real risks. And that is the reason, by the way, that I have not drunk the mail balloting Kool-Aid. And to the degree that I've done any advocacy in this situation, it's been to view mail balloting in 2020 as an emergency situation, because it does bring about risks, a little bit of fraud, but barely enough to be concerned about a lost vote concern. But if you have, various medical conditions, I'm now 62. I'm taking antibiotics for surgery. I shouldn't be voting. Some of us shouldn't be voting in person, although I'm going to be voting in person. This is a different situation, and I wish people would take that in mind about the conditions under which we are voting, and not to imagine this will be the permanent way in which we vote. We can have that fight later on about whether this is how we should always vote. This is a special circumstance.
Shifting gears a little bit, misinformation and disinformation. Mark Dowdy asks, is foreign interference predicted to be a problem during this election? And sort of on a related question, Amber Chesborough asks, is the Healthy Elections Project monitoring social media for disinformation or advising state and local governments on how to do this?
Yeah, a couple of things. So the first question, actually, those are 2 really great questions. I'll take them in order. Mis and disinformation, foreign actors are as active as they were in 2016. All the intelligence points in that direction. Now, despite what you would come to believe by listening to our president, it is the case that the federal government has a very large and a very robust program to identify, mitigate, and push back against some of the not only the mis and disinformation, but the hacking and particularly the hacking and the other efforts to interfere with the election on the technical side. But certainly we have already seen instances on the social media of the same actors from 2016 being involved in trying to stoke dissension, kind of do all the nasty things they did in 2016. They're doing that in 2020. Now, this is another talk, and actually you might want to get sometimes Adam Berinsky, my colleague from political science, who studies these sorts of things, to talk to you. Political science will tell you that in terms of persuasion, these efforts actually are a drop in the bucket. They're serious, they shouldn't be happening, we need to stop them. But it's actually, the problem is domestic people, you and me and my sister and other people on social media sharing stuff that we shouldn't be sharing. And it doesn't take Russians to start that. Now, with respect to healthy elections, yes and no. Our lane is election administration. However, Nate, in addition to one of Nate Pursley's hats at Stanford, is that he's director of the Cyber Policy Center, and they have actually set up a center that is receiving news from state and local officials about misinformation around elections, and working then with the social media platforms to try to put a stop to it. There's something at Stanford called the Stanford Internet Observatory. They put together a program to try to deal with domestic mis and disinformation. One of the structural problems with DHS is that they are not allowed to respond to domestic sources of mis and disinformation. And so that's what's happening at Stanford. The head of that operation used to be the chief of security, cybersecurity at Facebook. And they are employing at Stanford the sorts of tools that Facebook was deploying to root out things. They're taking information. They are talking to election officials when things come out. They're also talking to the platforms when things need to be taken down. One final shout out, again, not everything can happen at MIT. Harvard has a great program. I'm on their advisory board. Kennedy School, something called D3P program, Defending Digital Democracy, where they have been working with state and local election officials to do tabletop exercises around security, playbooks, a wide variety of programs. And so I will say that I am much less worried about cybersecurity issues now than I was 2 years ago because of what I've seen the federal government do, Harvard do, Stanford do, the National Guard, fusion centers. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff going on to help secure our election apparatus. Misinformation on the social media platforms is still an issue because of how human beings share information. But that's a different issue.
Okay. So it's the cybersecurity, but about the physical security. Evan Schwartz asks, how are mail-in ballots secured when in transit? And what keeps batches of ballots from being withheld or stolen before they're counted? How much data exists on this? How is it collected?
Yeah, so this question, so here's something I've discovered, that election security actually, I mean, in some ways has overlearned the lessons learned, the tough lessons of the 1890s and in the early 1900s, when stealing ballots was very common, when actually murder and mayhem was really common in polling places as ballots were stolen and destroyed and all the rest. And so from that time, from the kind of the rise of the from the reforms of the 1880s and 90s came a number of practices pertaining to the physical security of ballots. Those practices were reinforced in the 1940s. Some of y'all will remember, I remember the first time I ever voted was on a mechanical lever machine. Mechanical lever machines were put together in order to physically secure a polling place. So you go into an election administrator's office and they have protocols, they have safes, they have seals, they have manifests, they have all sorts of basically both physical security systems and information security systems. One of the most interesting times for me, at least, as the son of an accountant, in my learning about election administration over the last 20 years, has been actually to go into the canvases after an election when all the paperwork is reconciled. Now, Megan had to do some of this in Somerville, but in most states, all the paper has to be accounted for. Every piece of paper has to be accounted for. And it's clocked in, there's a number put on it, things are counted up. Does this match this thing over there? Double entry bookkeeping is alive and well in election departments. The rows have to sum to the columns down in the corner and all sorts of forms. So there are a lot of controls on the record keeping side in terms of chain of custody. There are procedures about when the mail comes in, where do those ballots go, who is observing. This all, by the way, best practice, which is almost universal as far as I can tell. Things happen in the open. So you have observers and things happen in the open. They, things are clocked in. For mail ballots particularly, you get checked off, they go to a particular place. At the end of the day, when say the counting and the process has ended, those ballots go into a locked place where they stay until they have to be dealt with, either counted or somehow other, or transported. They're generally transported in Massachusetts, usually transported by police officers. In other places by couriers, armed couriers, and other people, who are serious about the business that they're doing. So there are stories about ballots, ballots being lost, ballots in closets, and those sorts of things. But my guess is that if you were to go into an election department and ask them how they log things, that you would discover that there's a lot going on in that election department to make sure that all the paper is accounted for, coming in and going out. And one of the things that keeps people like Megan up late is that something doesn't add up at the end of the day. And things have to be reconciled before people can go home at the end of the night.
Yeah, we were one ballot off, and I think it was a tabulation error. But yeah, it kept us up. Unipark asks, have there been any significant changes or trends in registered voters in 2020?
In registered voters, so a couple of things. One, so here's, I don't know if this was what the question is getting to, but I should note that one of the things we noticed in March and April is that voter registration actually crashed during the height of the pandemic. In the state of Florida, for instance, there was practically no voter registration for about 3 months. And other states, it went down. It didn't go down as dramatically, but it still went down. Now, it's begun to bounce back, but it hasn't made up for that hole in March and April. And in the states where it took a crash, it crashed more in communities of color, African Americans, but particularly among Hispanics. And the story there that I've discovered is that it is much more common, especially for Hispanic voters in places like Miami and Orlando and in Texas, to register in person at drives, at churches, and those sorts of things, than to register online or to register at the Department of Motor Vehicles. So, and so having in-person voter registration possible has been a real challenge to those communities. So I don't know where things stand right now. There's some reports I need to take a look at. But I would say that if there is right now a bit of a, something that kind of the political types are worried about, it's this deficit of Hispanic registrations in Florida, which was a real issue in the spring, and that a number of citizen groups are working really, really hard to counter. It should be noted, well, no, I'll just stop that. I could keep going, but I have other
Actually, the next question, John O'Connell asks, there's much talk about voting issues in areas with poor and disadvantaged persons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's also where the polling places are closed. I mean, many of the reports that we've done at MIT documented the disproportionate closure of polling places in underserved communities and its effect on turnout in the primaries. And so that's a real concern that people should be aware of.
The question, Amber, from Amber, what's your assessment of state and local capabilities to do quality assurance sampling and or recounts if they're needed?
It really varies. I should say that on quality assurance and recounts and auditing and those sorts of things, one of the most interesting developments over the last decade or so has been a new form of auditing called risk limiting audits, which has actually been imported from quality assurance and manufacturing going back into the early 20th century. And a number of states are adopting these more, I would say, more sophisticated auditing techniques of tabulation. Traditional recounting is incredibly inefficient. You recount everything and it's labor intensive, et cetera. There are requirements. Massachusetts has a requirement that you go and randomly pull out 1% of ballots and you look at them. Again, really inefficient, both in terms of kind of the common sense use of the term efficiency and from a statistical sense. You just don't learn a whole lot from those traditional audits. Risk limiting audits are organized around the idea that in close elections, you need to look at more ballots to ensure that the tabulation was right than in elections that are blowouts. And in order to do those risk limiting audits, you need to be able to make up a manifest so that you can identify by name, not literally the voter's name, but by some identification number, every single ballot in a state. Because in order to do that sort of audit correctly, you have to be able to say, I need ballot number 479 in precinct 3, ward 4 from Cambridge for this audit. And you need to be able to pull that ballot out in order to, and so Colorado, Georgia, a few other states are doing that better auditing procedure. It's a big sea change, quite frankly. I think that, traditionally, the type of system I was describing earlier with kind of double entry bookkeeping, a lot of keeping track of stuff, et cetera, it's a lot of tedious work that people are not very good at doing. And you do find on the margin errors being made. You find a tabulation error, like one ballot, and you're searching around for that. This movement toward more sophisticated auditing that we're seeing in several states, and we had a big conference on this topic 2 years ago at MIT with academics and election officials to talk about doing more of this. One of the great things about that is that the manifests and the controls over ballots get even tighter than they are now. And so, it's too late for 2020, but I suspect one of the trends in running elections over the next several years is going to be tightening up even further on the ballots so that we can do better auditing, better control, and better assurance to the, to the voters that, that the result of the election was right.
Let's see. Ooh, one last question. Well, for Massachusetts residents, can you provide any guidance on question 2 and ranked voting, how this will change things, or?
Okay, so I have a political science union card, so I am required as a member of the union to just note that every way of voting is arbitrary up to some level, and is subject to manipulation, and is subject to paradoxes and weird outcomes. Ranked choice voting is subject to that. Plurality voting is subject to that. They're all subject to that. I'm probably, well, I will tell you how I'm going to vote. I will say this, that it's unfortunate that some people think that just simply changing the way that we vote is going to radically remake politics, because I don't think folks can think ahead about how any of these reforms will remake politics. There were promises made in Cambridge in the 1940s when we adopted our way of voting. And since this is MIT, I think most of y'all understand Cambridge votes in a different way. We have essentially a kind of something that looks like ranked choice voting. And one consequence of it is that there's a bunch of people in Cambridge who just, it's too much information, it's too hard to vote, and they just don't vote. On the other hand, other people just love it and figure out how to vote. We survive with it. So there are some people who are in favor of 2 because they believe it will make politics more centrist. They will, increase turnout. There's a number of claims for which there is either no evidence or weak evidence. That having been said, I mean, I do think that there are good arguments to be made that in partisan primaries, like the congressional primary we just saw last month, that it is possible to have kind of the plurality election, first past the post, create a nominee who gets nominated with a small fraction of the vote, 20, 15%, depending on how many other people are running. And that person wins because there have been other candidates who basically split the votes of kind of the center of the district. And my worry, so political science union card, my worry is always that in plurality elections, especially in primaries, that you can get extreme candidates winning when the more centrist candidates split the vote. And something like ranked choice voting can help to guard against that under certain circumstances. And I'm a gradualist in election reform. Because when people ask me about my data science center and some of the things I work in, I say that my goal is to overcome the tendency in election administration to view things from almost a religious perspective. People have beliefs, and I want it to be based on science and evidence. And I think the evidence around ranked choice voting is tough. It's not to say you should vote against it or you should vote for it. I think the thing I will just say is that people should be tempered in their anticipated, what they anticipate will happen. At the risk of repeating, I think if it does pass, it will probably be more useful in Massachusetts in the primaries than in the general election, because we don't have very strong third parties. It's probably had a bigger effect in Maine, where they've had third parties and independents, and it would probably be more more consequential in other states where minor parties have played a bigger role. So sorry if I probably danced around that one and was evasive, but there you go.
Okay. All right. I know I said one last question, but one last question. William and Paula ask, how common is the kind of technical snafu as happened this week in New York City, where ballot return envelope addresses did not match to whom the ballot was sent? Are vendors like the New York City contractor vetted, and how can a jurisdiction guard against third-party incompetence or malice?
Yeah, that's so actually, thanks for mentioning incompetence or malice. So before actually answering that question, I have one of my duties is to inform people of something that's referred to in election administration called Hanlon's razor. It's kind of a cousin of Occam's razor. And Hanlon's razor is this: never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. And so something like that was just described is likely incompetence rather than malice. That's usually what we find. I have to say that right now this is a problem that and is one of these capacity growing pain issues that I alluded to early in my talk, that there's a small number of vendors in the United States that have specialized on election mail. There's one large equipment manufacturer for the sorting equipment, like I showed you, Rombeck. And there are a couple of other smaller dealers, and there's a few within every state. There's like one or two fulfillment houses sometimes for mail ballots. But I mean, again, New York, they've only had about 1% of their ballots done by mail, and so they haven't had to contract this out. And those contractors have never done elections before, and they're not used to being as precise as elections have to be. And so, if I am worried about something, it's stuff like that, where a well-meaning, honest contractor who is not used to being that precise gets the contract and then makes mistakes. We saw that in Georgia during their primary, big time. And I'm afraid we're probably going to see that this time too. Yet another reason: if you're going to vote by mail, request it now, get it back soon, or walk it in through the drop box, because there are more amateurs out there than we would like, or first timers out there working really hard, but they don't have the experience. And so we really have to be more vigilant as voters this time around to make sure our ballot gets back.
Okay, well, I guess we'll just have to, so we're all kind of depending on the post office.
Well, depending on the post office, to get at least to get the ballot if you want to vote by mail. But again, in Massachusetts, you can there are drop boxes, or you can take it by the municipal elections office as well. You cannot drop it off at the polling place, but you can take it to a drop box or the election office. And in fact, by the way, in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, the three states that have been doing all vote by mail for the longest, and they're the best at this, most voters in those states actually return their ballots by mail. I'm sorry, in person. Most of them return their ballots in person, and I think that we should learn from them and return our ballots in person, even if they get delivered to us by the mail.
Yeah, and if you do bring your ballot into the polling place, it can be, at least in Massachusetts, you can give it to the warden or the clerk, and it will be voided, and we'll give you a new one. But
you'll have to do it all over again.
Yes, you'll have to fill it out all over again, but it is possible. And if and yeah, again, I think the drop boxes stay out until until polls close on election day, so you can always just drop it in. I think they said they were trying to put drop boxes at the polling places, so
we'll see.
We'll see. But all right, I think that is, we are over time now, so I think I'll just, I know we could go, I'm sure we could all go on all evening. So thank you very much, Professor Stewart. And if anybody didn't get their questions answered, maybe go to the Healthy Elections website and see if it's been answered there.
Or email me, and I'm always happy to exchange emails and talk to MIT people.
Yes. And we're going to do our best to get the recording of this up on the MIT Club of Boston's YouTube channel as soon as we can.
Right.
So.
Thanks.
Well, good night.